So this is it for today's class. In this class you've learned how to create a minimalist yet expressive illustration by using color, value, and a limited color palette. You have also learned how to add texture to your vector illustration in Photoshop to give it a kick. I hope you feel inspired to create. For this class project, create a minimalist illustration. Its topic can be anything that speaks to you, or you can create a character taking a selfie like I did. But remember to keep it simple. Focus on a limited color palette, value, and contrast. Be sure to share your work in the project section. I'm so excited to see what you will create. Thank you so much for watching. See you in my next class. Hello everyone, I'm Olga Hashim and I'm an illustrator and graphic designer based in Houston, Texas. Welcome to my illustration class. In this class you will learn how to create fun yet minimalist illustration using a limited color palette. We will create a sketch first, render it in Adobe Illustrator, and then add beautiful subtle textures in Adobe Photoshop. To dig deeper, I will show you how to draw freehand with the help of a graphic tablet. Then we will talk about the importance of color in illustration and how and why to choose limited color palettes. We will also talk about the importance of value and contrast and how to incorporate it into your illustration to make it really stand out. And finally, you will learn how to make your illustration shine by applying beautiful texture to it in Photoshop. I will show you how to harmoniously apply two different textures together to achieve a cohesive final look. To top it all off, I will share with you what tools, settings, and shortcuts I use throughout my process, along with my best tips and tricks. To take this class, you will need a graphic tablet and a basic knowledge of Adobe Illustrator and Photoshop. I'm very excited to get started, so let's begin. So, to make my workflow comfortable, I create a copy of a sketch and I place it next to the original one. Having two sketches next to each other helps me a lot during my process, and I will explain to you why a little later in the class. I will lower the opacity of this one to, let's say, 28-30%. I need it to look a little faded, like this, so it doesn't interfere much with the vector shapes I will be creating on top of it. I will be building up my illustration around these two sketches. Let's name this layer Sketches and let's lock it. Then I create another layer on top of the sketch one. Let's call it Vectors. This layer is the layer where I will draw vector shapes. I keep sketches on a locked separate layer so they don't get in the way when I draw over it. Also, it will be easier for me to find and hide sketches further down the road when I have lots and lots of sub layers under the vector layer. So this little organization trick works really great for me. In the next video we will talk about color blocking, creating first rough shapes, and why it's important to start with the whole and then move on to details and not vice versa. Welcome back. In this and the next lesson I will be talking to you about why I implement certain processes like color blocking into my workflow. I will be talking as I draw, but don't worry, I will tell you all about the tools I use in my process later in this class. Let's get over some theory first. So, first thing that I do when I start to digitize my illustration is color blocking. Although I call this process color blocking, I don't really think of my color choices much at this point. My main goal here is to fill my canvas with shapes filled with color, so I guess I shape block. These shapes don't have to be perfect. In fact, they don't have to look perfect at all. They serve as a basic material that I will perfect in the next steps. In my opinion, it's never a good practice to start drawing perfect shapes one by one right away. Such practice may result you in spending too much time on drawing, let's say, her head, to figure out later that it doesn't really work with the rest of her body or the surroundings. The rule of thumb at this stage is to start from the whole, to have your rough shapes in place, to see how they work together, and only then move on to perfecting each one of them. I call it moving from the whole to details and not the other way around. Also, it's way easier for your eyes and brain to analyze canvas filled with color shapes put together rather than analyzing scattered shapes on an empty canvas. Therefore, I never really start with just an outline. Often, proportions start to look way more different when you fill outlines with color. Often, compositions that looked good in plain outlines start to fall apart as you add color. You see, there is something very comforting when I have my rough illustration done as an opposite of starting by working on details. laid against white canvas and thinking of how to put them all together later. My point here is that one should start with the whole and then move on to working on details and not the opposite. Don't start with details. To understand this concept better, think of the way sculptures work. They start building up a shape by creating a rough clay lump and then removing unwanted material to perfect the sculpture. I prefer to add some sort of color right away. If colors distract you, you can work in grayscale at this stage. It's a really good practice as well, and it helps you to figure out contrast and value. I will talk more about it later. I start with color rather than grayscale because it's my personal preference. But if you are more comfortable to start in grayscale, feel free to do that. The illustration I'm creating in this class is about selfie culture. My main idea is to depict a girl taking a selfie in her room. I want to give this illustration a feel that one can instantly recognize or relate to. Basically, I want it to be a little behind the scenes of a common selfie. Let's go ahead and sketch it. I usually start with a very rough doodle like this. I do it to establish a composition and give myself an idea where I want to place things around the canvas. Then I create a new layer where I define the shapes a little more clearly. I always stress the importance of sketches, and this class won't be an exception. Sketches serve as foundation for your future illustration. Why? While sketching, you can quickly see if your idea works as well on paper as it did in your head. Sometimes certain ideas just don't work that well once you put them on canvas, or they need adjustments. A sketch allows you to figure it out quickly, as an opposite of jumping into a graphic design software right away and spending a significant chunk of your time rendering your illustration to further realize that it doesn't quite work. It's way easier, not to mention faster, to make a new sketch or rework an initial one than to scrap your Illustrator file and start from scratch all over again. When you work with a client, it's a rule of thumb to start with a sketch and get it approved prior starting any work in Illustrator or Photoshop. Another thing that I want to mention here that it's best to establish a ratio for your illustration in the very beginning of the process as well. I would advise you to do that because when a commissioner approaches you, they very often give you precise dimensions of a future illustration. Dimensions limit your composition choices, so basically you have to build a strong composition within a given canvas size. You won't be able to be like, hey, my composition works best as a square, not as a rectangle. Can we change a ratio? Or, hey, my composition works best vertically, not horizontally. Can we change that? The size of my illustration is 1600 pixels by 1200 pixels. So I will be taking into consideration my whole canvas as I work and not doing something like that. If you've ever switched to oil painting after working in watercolor for a long time, you probably understand very well what I mean. When you work in watercolor, you are able to crop your artwork after it's complete if the size of your artwork is different from the size of your paper. When you work with oil, you can't crop your canvas, right? So you have to think of how to fit your artwork into your canvas size from the very early stages of your process. The main goal of creating a sketch is to convey concept/idea, mood, and composition of your future illustration. Therefore, you don't have to spend hours perfecting your sketch. It should be clear enough so you and your client would be able to read it. Going too much into detail and perfecting is not necessary at all. So you can see I don't focus on drawing fingers, for example. All the perfecting and detailing will be happening later in Adobe Illustrator. So remember, we create a sketch to establish a concept, composition, and mood of your future illustration. This sketch is complete. I will save it to my iCloud to use it for my further work in Adobe Illustrator. In the next lesson, I'm going to show you how I work with sketches in Adobe Illustrator and how I organize layers in the very beginning of my process to ensure a comfortable workflow. This step is a very important one, but if you have watched one of my previous classes, you probably already know how to export your Illustrator file into Photoshop. If so, please feel free to skip this lesson and proceed to the next one, but if you are new, continue watching. So, to work with texture comfortably in Photoshop, we want to have each shape on its own separate layer. If I export this Illustrator file to Photoshop as is, the end PSD file will consist of just one layer. That's because although I have all the shapes located on different sublayers, they all still belong to this main layer. I need to change that and transfer each shape onto its own layer instead of leaving them on sublayers. With that being said, prior hitting export, I should go through a few preliminary steps to properly prepare my Illustrator file for export to Photoshop. I have a habit of saving my original file under a new name, just to make sure that I will have a copy of it in the future. By the way, we don't need this sketch layer anymore, so I will unlock it and delete it like so. I have two copies of the background layer, so let's delete one of them. Next step is to ungroup all the grouped objects. Okay, in this particular case, I can simply unite these as they should be united. I want it to be one shape instead of a couple of, separate ones. I can unite this thing here too. I unite them right now because I don't need each piece of this particular shape to be on its own layer in Photoshop. I want them to be on one layer. Now, let's click on this arrow to hide all the sub-layers. Next, I click anywhere outside of my artboard to make sure that nothing is selected. Then I select this layer like so. This is important. Next, I go to this hamburger menu and choose Release to Layers sequence. Voila! Each shape is now located on its own layer. All that's left to do is to select all of these new layers and drag and drop them above the original layer. I will scroll back down now to delete the original layer. It's empty now and I don't need it. Next, I will go to File, down to Export, Export As. I will choose PSD as a file format and I will check Use Artboards box. This box lets Illustrator know that you want to export everything within your artboard, but nothing located outside of it. Sometimes you leave a few objects here and there outside of your artboard, so it helps in cases like that. It's not the case today, but I thought I will mention this little trick anyway. I can press Export now. In this window, make sure that Right Layers box is checked. Otherwise, all your newly created layers will be merged into one. We don't want that. Okay, now as my file is exported as PSD, let's go ahead and texturize it. In this lesson, I'm going to show you how I perfect shapes and what tools and settings I use to do so. When it comes to drawing humans and animals, I prefer to use my Wacom tablet and my Wacom pen. It allows me to achieve more organic shapes than when I draw just with my mouse or the pen tool. When I draw with my Wacom pen, I feel more freedom and less restriction. In Illustrator, you can either draw with the brush tool or with the pencil tool. I prefer the pencil tool, but it's just my personal preference. So this is what we are going to look into today. Let's have a look at my settings for the pencil tool that allows me to work comfortably. To bring up the settings menu, I double-click the pencil tool icon. The most important part here is to have your keep selected and edit selected path boxes checked. Let me show you what happens when it's unchecked, and then I will show you what changes when I check these boxes. Let's uncheck keep selected first. I will try to edit this shape now. Once I release the mouse, it gets deselected. If I want to edit it further, I have to manually select it and then correct the shape. Once I release the pen, it gets deselected again. It's kind of a tedious process, isn't it? When I perfect a shape, I don't want to go through a process of constant manual selection. Let's check this box again and see what happens. Now, when I release the pencil, after each edit, the shape stays selected. This box spares me the labor of manual selection every time I release the mouse. Not to mention, it saves time. Now let's go into the pencil settings once again and let's uncheck Edit Selected Path box. I will try to edit this shape again, but Illustrator doesn't let me do that anymore. Instead of correcting the initial path, it draws a new one. So I better check the Edit Selected Path box again. Now I can edit the shape over and over again until I'm satisfied with the result. Another thing that I want to mention here is Fill New Pencil Strokes box. I keep this box checked, so every time I draw a shape, it gets filled with color automatically. If I uncheck it, I will be drawing empty shapes and I will have to fill them in with color manually every time. So keep this one checked as well. When you draw in Illustrator using a graphic tablet, it's not much more different than drawing with a regular pencil. To me, the biggest difference here is a path flow. Let's open up the pencil tool settings once more and look at the fidelity setting. Mine is located right in the middle. Let's see what it gives me. The path flow is pretty smooth. Let's change the fidelity setting to accurate and try to draw again. See, the edges of the shape look rough now. Just compare it to the first shape. If I bump fidelity all the way up to smooth, the shape will come out well, very smooth. Play with this setting to find your comfortable range. Mine is in the middle. So yeah, when you start working with the pencil tool, it will feel different from drawing with a classic media or in Photoshop, but it is just something you have to get used to. So these are the settings that I use for the pencil tool as I draw in Adobe Illustrator. I correct the shapes until I'm satisfied with the way they look. So let's go ahead and start perfecting everything. As you draw, you can see that thin red line showing up. It shows you a path you are drawing. Once you release the pencil, it gets filled in with color, and then you can see how the object you are working on is changing. I actually really enjoy this because I don't have to use the eraser tool. So it makes it really easy to correct shapes just by using the pencil tool. So I will finish drawing this character using the pencil tool and the approach I just talked to you about. I will speed up the video here because it's all going to be pretty much just a repetitive motion, and I will talk to you more on how I draw humans. My style is definitely not realistic, although I do keep body proportions close to reality. I can sometimes make a person's head a little smaller than it is according to anatomy rules, and I can elongate characters' legs a bit. But I don't really exaggerate anything. What I do is that I simplify a human body. I don't try to emphasize muscles and all that, the way you would do it if you draw according to academic standards. I don't draw each and every curve there is in an actual human body. Instead, I simplify everything and only make accents on the main curves, like, for example, waist or hips. I simplify facial features a lot. In many of my illustrations, I even skip drawing eyes, for instance. The fun thing about illustration is that you can bend the rules. You aren't tied to academic standards unless this is what you want to pursue. You can experiment with proportions, make heads super small and legs really long and wide. You can go abstract or mix realistic and abstract approaches together. You can make small objects appear way larger than they actually are in real life. Mix things together. Change the color of water to pink and make human skin purple. Experiment, explore, and just have fun with it. This illustration is pretty normal though. Okay, so let's draw a cat now. I follow the same rules and techniques for drawing cats or dogs as I do when I draw humans. I use the pencil tool and I simplify shapes a lot, like a lot. I make them look somewhat cartoonish. I enjoy having my second sketch here, as I can check in with it anytime I want, while another one got all covered up with vector shapes in the process. Now, as our main characters are complete, let's move on to refining the background. Let's talk about the importance of value contrast in an artwork. The term value in the art world is used when talking about lightness and darkness. Our eyes read objects surrounding us because of how dark or light they are. Basically, if your artwork has the same or very similar value throughout, it will appear bland or hard to read. One's eyes will skim through it without having anything to grasp on. The best way to check on value in your artwork digitally is to switch it to grayscale. I select everything, go to Edit, Edit Colors, Convert to Grayscale. It still reads pretty well. You can see a high contrast here, here, and here. I can still read my illustration clearly. Another way is to squint your eyes like this when looking at your artwork. This way you will instantly see the darkest and the brightest spots in your illustration if they are present. If there is not enough contrast between light and dark values, an artwork will appear very monotonous. This last squinting tip is an old school one. This is what artists do when drawing or painting with traditional media. The convenience of graphic design programs allows us simply to switch to grayscale without doing any squinting. If objects in your illustration have the same or very similar value, they will sort of blend in together, and your illustration will be hard to read, as I mentioned previously. Light and dark values have to be present in your illustration in order for it to stand out. You can create value contrast by putting objects of different value next to each other. Value and contrast make it interesting for an eye to look at an illustration. But remember, you don't have to make each and every object to look contrast in relation to the one next to it. Too much contrast will result in the same mish-mashy effect as not enough contrast. So keep it balanced. For example, if we examine my illustration, you'll notice that her torso stands out next to the pink background. This is because this background has a light value and her torso has darker value in relation to the background. This creates contrast. Then her legs sort of blend in with the violet background because her legs and violet background have similar darker value. This flow from high value contrast to almost no value contrast makes this figure more interesting for an eye to look at. Let's look at the window. It has a very light value and the background has dark value, which creates contrast and makes the window stand out. This illustration is a game of very contrasting values and very similar values. I intentionally made the plant value here not drastically different from the background, and I will intensify this effect in Photoshop later, so it doesn't call for much attention and doesn't distract from the main scene. Same with this structure. If I'd make every object in this illustration stand out, like her torso or the window, the illustration would appear very scattered and it would make it hard to read. So when you work with value contrast, remember to keep it balanced. Too much or not enough contrast will make your illustration tough to comprehend. An understanding of value and contrast comes with practice, and eventually you will be able to incorporate it into your illustrations intuitively. If color distracts you from working with value and contrast, simply switch to grayscale for the time being and color it later. As you could notice by now, starting in grayscale has many benefits. Tip on how to determine where to apply high contrast value and low contrast value. Try to play with high value contrast and low value contrast when you want to emphasize a certain part of your illustration. For example, I wanted a window to pop up, so I made the wall behind it way darker. I also wanted to make her torso stand out, so I put a lighter background behind her. Let's turn it off for a second. See, her figure doesn't read as well as it did when the pink background was present. Now, let's see how to choose color value in Adobe Illustrator. Illustrator makes it pretty simple actually. With our pink background selected, let's double-click the fill icon to open the color picker. So it shows us the value range for the pink shade I chose. So you can do that with any color. Another tip on how to distribute value and contrast in your illustration is to determine the source of light and build other values in relation to it. Basically, all the objects located closer to the source of light will have lighter values, and objects located further away or in the shade will have darker values. Let's look at one of my illustrations as an example. So, the source of light is the laptop and this floating screen thing. They are the brightest spots in the illustration. Next competing values are the spotlights on the girl. Everything else is shaded and hence has very similar values. The contrast I created here by using different values produces the illusion of dark room lightened by a bright laptop screen. If it wasn't for the value contrast, this illustration would not produce the same effect as it does now. So this was a lesson on value contrast, and now it's time to export our illustration from Illustrator to Photoshop to add some nice texture. In this lesson, I'll show you how I add highlights and shadows to my illustration to give it some more charm. Let's begin. I'll start with her legs. Since we have this ray of light illuminating her legs, I want to emphasize it. So I left-click on the legs layer while holding Command to create a selection around this shape. Then I'll bring up the color picker to choose a lighter color for the highlight. I will be using the same runny inkers brush that I used in the previous lesson, but I will make its size bigger. And then I will simply paint over her knee like so. I made a selection around her leg so Photoshop doesn't let me to paint outside of it. It's okay that the brush gives some texture on the inner edge of the highlight. In fact, this is what I want. I like this texture. The most important part is to keep the outer edges of the leg sleek, which is super easy thanks to the selection. I now lower the opacity of the highlight a bit down to make it look less in your face. I painted this highlight on a new layer so I can easily manipulate it without affecting the actual legs layer. Now let's repeat the same process with her other leg. As you can see, I made this highlight longer than the previous one. I did it on purpose. Remember that perfect symmetry doesn't exist in nature. Beauty is always asymmetric. Making these two highlights different from each other, one longer and another one shorter, makes the illustration more compelling to the eye. Now let's add a highlight to her top upper arm. I want it to look as if it's illuminated by the light coming from the window. Now let's paint a highlight on her sock. I will do it in the same manner as I did it on her arm. I like it how there is a break in between of these highlights. There is no need to connect them by making this one longer. This gap here creates the beauty. If I fill in this gap with the highlight, this whole leg will look kind of monotonous. Time to enhance the highlight on this sock. But here's the thing. This sock shape and the rough edge texture are located on two separate layers. I am naming them so you can see better. I need to create a selection around both the sock and its texture. To do that, I will first create selection around the sock by left-clicking on its thumbnail while holding Command, and then I'll hold down Shift and Command and left-click on the sock texture thumbnail. Here you go. We have a selection running around both shapes. And now I will simply paint over the existing highlight with a more brighter color. I will select all socks layers now and bring them to the top of the layers panel because I want to make sure that the window light shape doesn't cross over the sock. Let's add some shadows now. I want to add the first one below her t-shirt. For that, I will sample her skin color and choose a darker value. As you can see, I create a selection around the shape I want to add a shadow to. This way I make sure that the shadow will stay within a respectful shape. Here we go. Now I will repeat the same process with the shadow below her sleeve. Then I want to separate her head from her neck by adding a shadow. This is a nice touch and it makes such a big difference. Let's zoom out and look at the results. Looks much better, doesn't it? Just compare it to the option without any shadows and highlights. They make such a big difference. Now I want to add a couple of shadows to the pink paper background, so it all feels like the same style. Just like that, using a value a little darker than the background. This little shadow emphasizes paper curvature. Finally, let's add a shadow here. It's another nice touch that may seem like nothing, but along with other details like that, it takes the illustration to the next level. Another thing that I want to do here is to make edges of this shadow rough as well. Let's do it real quick. This layer is above the legs layer, so we can see violet paint crossing over her feet. It can be easily fixed. I create a selection around the leg and then use the eraser tool to get rid of the excessive paint. I erase while staying on the violet shadow layer, but previously created selection allows me not to erase more than I need to. Pretty neat. So this is it for highlights and shadows. In the next lesson I will show you how to incorporate grainy texture into your illustration. I absolutely love applying texture to my illustrations because it brings them to the next level. It gives them a more hand-drawn look, if I can say so. Even when I add just a tad bit of texture, it makes an illustration really stand out. I've recently been into a more minimalist texture application, but I started to use two different brushes to create it. Basically, I add some grain into the background and I make certain shapes edges to look a little rough. In this lesson, I will explain to you how I choose where to apply texture and how I do it. So let's get started. I will begin by texturizing her hair. I will click on it once to select hair layer in the layers menu. I've been into Kylie's Runny Inkers brushes a lot lately and especially into this one, Blot 2561. Kali's brush sets now come with your Creative Cloud subscription, so it's pretty awesome. If you are not a Creative Cloud member though, I put together a file where you can find a link to a brush set with a similar effect. Find this PDF under the Resources tab. So, let's select my brush. It's 41 pixels right now, and let's leave it at this size. And I will start painting edges of the hair shape. I do it with my Wacom pen. I like to use this technique for texturizing hair because it gives it life, you know. Hair naturally have more fuzzy texture than, for example, skin. So it's nice to differentiate that. Okay, so this white shape is currently located higher in the layers panel than the hairs layer. I will move it down. So this part of her hair is straight. To draw a straight line, I will be using my mouse, not the Wacom pen. It's important. I will put a dot here, and then I will hold down Shift and click here. And just like that, Photoshop drew a straight line for me. I will explain to you why I used my mouse for that little trick rather than my pen a little later in this class. So how do I choose shapes to apply this fuzzy edge texture to? I pick the ones that don't have sleek edges naturally. For example, as I mentioned previously, hair is fuzzy, so I always texturize it unless I try to depict hair with lots of hairspray and gel on it. Then, animals are furry, so I use this texture when I draw them. Let's do that now actually. I'll sample the color of the cat with the eyedropper tool, make the brush size smaller and paint over the edges of this shape. This texture gives a more natural feel to objects when applying to the right ones. It's always important to think of different textures and make it a point to emphasize it in your work. For example, I will not add this texture to the edges of her skin because, you know, skin is smooth, in the sense that its texture is definitely different from hair or fur texture. So, apply your texture mindfully. All this time, I've been applying texture over the original shapes. But what if you want to make sure that you can get rid of it anytime you want in case you don't like it anymore? You can simply create a new layer on top of the original one and apply your texture over it. This way, you will be able to easily delete it if you ever get a feeling that you are not satisfied with the way it looks. I apply texture to this sock because I imagine that it's a nice, fuzzy, soft and cozy sock, so I want it to look this way. I will texturize this other sock as well. I applied texture to the sock on a separate layer as well, so now I can easily switch it off like this. Next, I want to make shadows casted by the window crossbars texturized as well. I don't really like straight lines like this. I think they look too machine-made, too digital, and I want to give them a more natural, hand-drawn feel. I will make a brush stroke thinner, sample the color, and will draw a new crossbar shadow on a separate layer. Again, I don't do it with my Wacom pen. I do it with my mouse and the brush tool. I will click at the beginning of the line here and then hold down Shift and click once again here, and Photoshop will finish the line for me. No need to try and draw this straight line freehand when there is an easier way around it. This one turned out too thick though, so let's get rid of it and make another one but thinner. I then hide the original shape because sometimes they pick from under the new texturized line and it doesn't look as good. I'll repeat this process with the other 3 lines. Now I want to show you why I draw straight lines with my mouse and not the Wacom pen. Here's the deal. Wacom pen is pressure sensitive, so look what happens when I repeat the same process with it. See, these lines have different thickness throughout because of my pen sensitivity. When I do it by using the mouse, it comes out perfectly even. If you want to make it thinner, just change the brush size in the settings menu. So, this is my tip for drawing straight lines in Photoshop. I can delete all this now. I will repeat this process for the actual crossbars. I now want to draw over these lines here on the curtain because, again, I don't like to keep long lines like this looking too sleek. I like to give them a more hand-drawn look and feel. These two I will be carefully drawing freehand. I do it on a new layer so I can delete it in case if I don't like the outcome. Yeah, I want to try and draw this once again. Here we go. Now I want to add some lines to the plant. But first let's bring these 2 leaves to the top, so the light coming from the window doesn't overlap with them. Although I illustrate in a minimalist style, it doesn't mean that I skip adding in these little details. They are actually something that adds charm to the piece. See, now this plant looks more interesting. Color choice for your illustration as well as an employment of value and contrast is as much as important as a strong concept. A clever concept will fall apart and will not create an impression it's supposed to without a proper combination of color, contrast and value. When choosing a color palette, try to limit a number of shades you want to use in your illustration. It's very tempting to try and incorporate all those pretty colors our beautiful world has to offer, but unfortunately it may result in mishmash and force your illustration to fall apart. We want our illustration to look cohesive and put together. A good exercise here is to limit yourself to just 3 colors. For example, black, gray and white, or black, gray and yellow, or purple, blue and pink. You get the idea. Or create an illustration using only shades of blue, or try to use shades of red only. Here are some examples of illustrations that I created using limited color palettes. As you can see, all of them have one dominating color. For example, this one has purplish pinkish shade as the main color. Instead of making her dress, let's say, green, pumpkins orange and her hair brown, I limited my color choices to a narrow range. Another example. The dominating color in this one is blue. Purplish bluish again. This approach will teach you that you can actually convey a lot and reach very interesting results through the use of limited color palettes. When choosing a color palette, I tend to pick one dominating color and then build up the rest of my color palette by choosing shades within the range of this initial color. In other words, I use analogous colors. Let me show what I mean. For this illustration, I want purple to be a dominating color. Let's choose it from the color picker. This one looks good to me, so let's press OK. Well, maybe this one. This is the range where I will look for the rest of my color swatches. In other words, I limited myself to a certain chunk of the color wheel. If you'll have a look at this traditional color wheel here, you will see that my color range is within this perimeter. You can deviate from it a little bit in certain cases, but do it mindfully. I don't want to go in here to look for dominating colors. I will go there to look for a complementary color that I will use to give my illustration a little kick. But more about it later. Let's start building color for this illustration. I like some of the elements to blend in with their surroundings. This piece has a distinct edge here where it meets the lighter shape, so I don't have to worry about it being impossible to be red. Let's change her hair to black. I don't go to pitch black though, I don't want it to look too dark. Now let's select these guys and find a color for them. As you can see from what I'm doing, it's a matter of experimentation. I choose a hue and then I look back at it to see if it works. If something feels off, I opt for another shade. Let's switch the color of this shadow to the background one. It appears lighter now, but only because I have another layer sitting on top of it. When choosing a color, I usually go with my gut. This feeling comes with practice, and although I've been in the art field for a very long time, sometimes it is still challenging to find the right combination. When it happens, I push through it, do several color options until I'm satisfied with the result. If you find it hard to work with color, I recommend to learn through looking at works of established artists. It can be paintings in museums, art books, works by contemporary artists you enjoy. Notice how they use color, get inspired, practice, be patient, and it will come to you. This is just how it works, through observing and practice. I want this spot to blend with the background as well, but I think I will do it later in Photoshop. I'll make its color slightly different from the background for now, so I can see it easily when I perfect it. I want her skin to be warm, so I will go for a very dark red. It's always nice to create some contrast by combining warm and cool shades. The background is definitely cold, so her skin tone will look warm in relation to it. I will make the cat dark violet, so it stands out against the main character's legs. I want the window crossbars to have the same color as the background, so let's do just that. The little ring light on top of the phone is gonna be white because, well, it's the light and it must be bright here. I want to put an accent on the socks. Accent color is a color that falls off from the color range you are using in your illustration. For me, it will be yellow or orange. Both look great against purple and blue tints. Never mind me reorganizing my layers, I just want to bring the yellow sock a bit up so it's not covered by another layer. I will also lower the opacity of this layer just a bit down. I want it to be more transparent. To find the color on the color wheel to use as an accent, look at the one that is opposite to the color you choose as the main one, opposite to a range of analogous color scheme of your illustration. So basically, since I am planning to build my color palette within violet/purple range, complementary colors for me are yellows and oranges. If I would choose yellow as my main color, it would reverse and I'd use one of the blues or purples as an accent, while yellow will be dominating. For this illustration, I want violet/purple to be a dominating color. In this case, I will use a complementary yellow as a small accent, so it will not dominate in the illustration. Instead, it will give it a nice little kick. So this is one of the many ways how you can create a limited color palette with a color accent. When I create an illustration for a client, I am usually limited by a given color palette. But when I work on a personal piece, I hardly ever have a 100% clear idea of what colors I'm going to use in this illustration. If you have a look at my illustrations, you will notice that I love shades of purple, pink and blue, but there are so many different hues of each one of them that I often find myself spending hours trying to find the right one for an illustration. I often start by creating a color palette consisting of shades that I like and I want to try. And then I try different ways of incorporating them into an illustration until something clicks and the color palette feels just right. During this process, I exclude a lot of colors from my original color swatches. It can be painful to let them go, but it's for the greater good. Choosing color palettes, combining different shades together and figuring out color proportions can be challenging and it requires practice. Even seasoned illustrators often spend hours trying out different color combinations. So don't get frustrated if the right color palette doesn't come to you right away. It's totally normal. I put together a file with some of my favorite color inspiration resources. By the way, this file will also include color swatches that I used to create this illustration. Feel free to experiment with them. You can find the file under the Resources tab. So in this lesson, I talked to you about how beneficial limited color palettes are and how to create them. And we talked about adding a color accent to give your illustration a nice touch. In the next lesson, I'm going to refine and perfect this illustration while talking to you about what tool and important settings I use when I draw freehand with Wacom. So, remember how in one of the previous lessons in this class I said that I will take care of this light here later. Now it's time to do it. It has very clear-cut edges, which doesn't really look natural. To fix this, I will be using one of my grainy brushes as an eraser. These brushes are my custom brushes that I made to achieve effects like this one. They can be used as brushes or as erasers, and I will start to erase the part of the shape to create somewhat a gradient effect. I will work on the shape until the clear-cut edge disappears and the white light looks like it melts into the background as it approaches the girl's face. Next, I will switch to the runny brush again to paint a shadow casted on the phone by her hand. I forgot to do it in the previous lesson, so let's do it now. As always for shadows, I pick a color which value is a tad darker than the original shape. This spot looks out of place. Why? Because it's way too bright. As you can see, it's not located within the reach of light, so I will make it darker. I want it to blend in with the background actually. I will paint over the shape with the background color, leaving just a small lick of a previous color on the left to create a highlight. It makes sense as some light from the window should illuminate the spot at least a little bit. Look how it looks now. This illustration starts to come together. I'm thinking that the window and the light casted on the floor are too white. I want to reduce this whiteness and mute them just a little bit. It will not take away from the contrast they create being next to the dark background, but it will make them easier on the eye. So, I will click on this light on the floor to select it. I create a selection around it and I choose a very light violet shade. Next, I will go to Edit, Fill, Background Color. OK. Feels much better, doesn't it? Let's repeat the same process with the window. Changing the window color made the curtain stand out actually. I like it. Do you see it? But I have a little different plan for this curtain. I want it to look darker. Hence, I will fill it with a darker violet shade, like so. Will anything change if I lower the opacity? Let's try it. No, not really. Let's leave it like that. Now I want to make this one darker, because I don't like how it looks with this big white gap on top. I will fill it with a darker color, the same way I did just now. And I will repeat the process for this shape as well. It's time to work on the violet background now and put some more grainy texture to use. I want to darken the background edges to create a somewhat vignette effect. This will help an eye to focus on the main scene faster and easier, pulling the whole composition together at the same time. It's a good trick. Make the edges of your work a little darker, and it will unite an illustration. You don't have to apply this trick to each one of your illustrations, only if you feel that it requires some framing. Because you know, a vignette is sort of a frame within the artwork. Here I want to mention that I use my grainy brushes as stamp brushes. I don't drag them, I stamp them. If I will paint with them as I would with a regular brush, the effect will smudge. Also, remember that this grainy texture is the second one I use in this illustration. I don't want them to overpower one another, so I am not going crazy with grain, as I don't want it to look overwhelming. So I carefully move around the edges, making the texture a little thicker at the bottom and lighter on top. I don't want it to look seamless throughout. Seamless isn't always what you are looking for. Look at your room. You will notice that either floor or the ceiling looks darker, so no need to make them the same. With the grainy texture in place, you can see that the plant pot doesn't blend with the background anymore. Let's correct it by applying some grain on it as well. Wow, this is way too much. I hit Ctrl Z to go a few steps back and try once again. It looks much better now. You can still read the right side of the pot, but it looks so muted that it still serves the purpose and meets my idea of blending with the background. Next, I want to add a touch of grain to this shadow. Speaking of my layer organization, because some of you have asked me about it previously, I tend to create a new layer for every object I want to apply texture to. But sometimes I skip this process and apply texture right on the original shape. I don't have a specific rule for when to create or not to create a new layer. I just tend to skip creating a new layer when the affected by texture area will be too small, or when I feel confident that I will not need to do any adjustments to the texture or to an original shape later. I feel like adding another coat of grainy texture to the background. Let's Let's also add some texture to this part of the paper background to make it blend with the background below. Perfect. I want to work on the pot once more. I don't like how grainy texture gets on the highlight here. So I will simply choose the highlight color and I will paint over the spot where the texture overlaps with the highlight to hide this excessive texture. Great. Now I will carefully paint this round corner on the top because, as you can see, the pot shape got messed up in the process. But luckily it can be easily fixed with a few paint strokes. I feel that this highlight is too bright though. I zoom out now to see how my illustration looks as the whole. Zooming out and looking at your artwork from the distance is a very good practice that allows you to see the big picture. It also allows you to see if there is something that doesn't quite work with the rest of the piece. Like right now, I can see that the highlight I have doubt about is indeed too bright. I want it to look more muted. Let's make it happen. I will paint over the existing highlight with a darker blue. I could simply fill it in with color by making a selection around it and then going to Edit Fill, but I've made a mess with this spot, so I have to do it manually. It's not a big deal though. Looks good to me. In the next lesson, I will continue to enhance this illustration, but more importantly, I'll show you how to make this light here look more alive. First off, let's blend this spot with the background after all. See, some of my decisions are changing as I zoom in and out. It's the process, guys. I will paint on the right edge of this shape to blend it in with the background. This selection isn't perfect because, as I mentioned earlier, the spot somehow went through a lot of post-production after it left Illustrator. But we can't really see it unless we create a selection around it, so it's all good. It happens. Let's now add some texture to the pink paper background to make it look in place. By in place, I mean that I want this illustration to look cohesive, and since we have a medium amount of texture in the violet background, this pink one requires some too. The texture coat will be lighter though, because I don't want this grain to look overwhelming. If, for example, I used a very light grain in the violet background, I would most likely skip adding texture to the pink one. Next thing I want to do is to make the edges of the light reflection on the floor to look rough. To do that, I have to paint its edges with the runny inker's brush. I will be using the color of the current reflection shape for that. To sample its color, I first have to hide the light shape sitting above it. This one. I hid it now. Why? Because if I leave it on, the eyedropper tool will sample its color and not the one I need to capture. Once I sample the correct color, I turn this layer visibility back on. Now I will simply outline the shape with the brush tool to create rough edges. We've got this gap showing up here. Let's paint over it to hide it. I will also elongate the crossbars shadows to fit the adjusted shape. Basically, I don't want these little white gaps to be visible. I like to pay attention to details like that because if I don't, my artwork will look sloppy and probably scattered. Sometimes it's perfectly okay to leave this mist register effect, but remember not to go overboard with it. Keep it balanced. Certain things need to be corrected. Let's move on to the light. First of all, I want to lower its opacity because it looks a tad too bright now. I want it to look less intense. I will create a new layer and outline the light shape with the runny inker's brush. I went for a very light color. Next, I will grab the paint bucket tool and fill this new shape with the color. I will now hide the older light shape and lower the opacity of the newly created one. Next, I will create a copy of this new light shape. I will name them Light 1 and Light 2 just so you can see them better in my layers panel. I will create a selection around the Light 2 and then add a mask to it. I bring up the selection once again and pick my brush tool. I will now erase the whole thing by painting over it with black. When you paint over a mask with black, it hides the shape, and when you paint over it with white, it reveals it back. See, the little icon mask is all black now, and before we had a white light shape sitting there. Now I will switch to white color and make my brush size smaller. I will paint over the mask with white to bring back the original shape. I am leaving these gaps all over intentionally, and you will see why. I'm switching to even smaller brush size to make these gaps finer and more random. The trick here is to follow the inclined direction of the original light shape. Now I can hide the light one layer. I kept it there as a spare copy just in case. Just to be safe. See, these darker strokes I've drawn create an illusion of movement. I don't want them to be overpowering, though, so I will keep them minimal. I want to add just a touch of this effect here. So I will paint over the mask with black to hide the original color, and then I will paint over it with white to reveal some of it back while leaving a few thin gaps. Here we go. This is how I do it. Now I want to make a little adjustment to this pink shadow here. I feel it looks too bright, so I will make it a few shades darker. This is still too intense, so let's try once again. Here, perfect. So, I zoom out once again and I see that the cat doesn't really stand out. I want it to look more contrast in relation to the girl's leg and background in general. This cat actually consists of multiple shapes located on different layers. I want to change color for all of them. I don't want to do it one by one, so I will find all of them in my layers panel. Just give me a minute to do it. Now I will group all of them, except of the white paw. The white paw stays. Right-click on the group and choose Merge Group. Now I can easily fill this newly created shape with a darker color. Here we go. You can see that this white paw doesn't quite fit. I will delete the shape, create a selection around the cat once again, create a new layer, and with just one paint stroke I will draw a new white paw that fits perfectly. I will zoom out once more. I now feel that this plant can look a little more permanent. I will select each one of its leaves one by one and fill them with the same color I used for the cat. Since the plant became darker, we are not able to read the lines on it. Let's draw them once again with a darker color. The last touch for this illustration will be adding a few shadows to the cat. I will lower the opacity down a little bit, and this illustration is complete. Yay! Normally, when I draw background, I use two approaches or the mix of the two, depending on what a background consists of. I use my Wacom tablet and draw freehand with the pencil tool when it comes to drawing more organic shapes, like for example nature objects, think trees or mountains, or objects with softer edges, like for example this sock on the floor in this illustration. When I draw man-made objects, like for example buildings or furniture, I use a combination of the pen tool, the rectangle tool, the ellipse tool, the shape builder tool, and the pathfinder panel. Why? Man-made objects tend to be more geometrical and have lots of straight lines. Hence, the tools I've just mentioned are perfect to express just that. By the way, you don't have to own a graphic design tablet to utilize these tools. You can easily operate them just with your mouse. No freehand drawing required. By the way, if you're interested to learn how to create an illustration in Adobe Illustrator just by using your mouse, you may want to check out some of my previous classes where I do just that. I will link them in the description for this class. In fact, some styles require even more organic shapes to look geometrical, therefore they don't require freehand drawing at all. I personally prefer to mix these two approaches, drawing freehand with the pencil tool and using the tools I've mentioned previously. Like right now, for example, I'm starting to edit the pink paper background. It curves, and I want this curve to look very organic rather than machine-made. By the way, the pen tool can substitute for the pencil tool in some cases, but I only use it when I want a shape to be more precise. Overall, I feel like the pencil tool has more flexibility. I've changed this color now just to be able to see it clearly as I edit it. I'll switch it back to the dark purple once I'm satisfied with the outcome. I want to make the edge of the shape straight. I don't want it to have even a subtle curvature. Therefore, I'll create a rectangle using the rectangle tool. Select both the rectangle and the shape in question, and use the pathfinder panel to subtract the rectangle. Voila! The shape is corrected. I quickly correct the pink shape so we don't see the background peeking in between of the two objects. And I will change the color back to the dark purple. When I work in Illustrator, I zoom out a lot so I can see how my illustration looks from the distance. It helps me to analyze how all elements work together, what needs to be adjusted, and so on. I'm now back to refining the pink background paper. I'm using the pencil tool again because I want its curves to look organic, as I mentioned before. This edge looks funny, so I'm going to use the anchor point tool to correct it. I simply click on the anchor point I want to correct, and it magically looks better. I like this tool and I use it when I need to straighten a corner of a shape. I will edit the yellow sock on the floor in a similar fashion. Probably some of you may find that you can draw in this style by using just the pen tool, but I personally feel that I have more control over what I can do when using the pencil tool. I use the pen tool when it comes to drawing straight lines. For example, I drew these crossbars with it. Let's make them thicker, by the way. I now need to draw the crossbars reflection on the floor, and I'll do it by using, guess what? The pen tool, that's right. I like using it for things like this because It creates a stroke and not a shape, which lets me easily manipulate its thickness using the stroke menu settings. There is no need to struggle and try to draw them with the pen tool when there is an easier way around it. Let's edit the light coming from the window. This light stream has a great effect on the composition of this piece. It sort of ties the illustration together and gives it unity. You can see how it starts from the window, goes across the canvas, touching the main character, then hits the floor and comes back to the window. I am editing it with the direct selection tool, moving individual anchor points. This tool is great for that. I will now perfect the curtain the same way as I did with the pink paper background. I'll take care of this little thing here. And finally, I will add some details to the curtain. Details are important. They spice up an illustration. I work in a rather minimalist style, but I do enjoy to add some details here and there to make my illustration pop. Speaking of details, let's add some to the cat. I want to make her paws white, so I do that by using the ellipse tool and then cutting off the unwanted parts with the shape builder tool. Now it's time for some final touches before starting with texture. Basically, I go over my artwork, zoom in and out a lot, and refine pieces that I feel can look more polished. I also just stare at it a lot, figuring out what all I can improve. And finally, let's add some light coming from the light ring. I'm drawing it with the pen tool. I can smooth it right now and make it look more natural by adding a white to transparent gradient, but I will not do it. Instead, I will make it look more organic in Photoshop. Okay, now I'm going to have the second round of stirring and improving. At this stage, I make sure that all shapes look smooth, sometimes slightly move objects and improve color just a bit. If I'm not satisfied with my color palette, this is where I start to really experiment with it. But this illustration isn't the case. I really like these colors. So, after doing all these little adjustments, I consider my artwork ready for texture. But before we move on to apply texture in Photoshop, let's talk about contrast and value in the next lesson.